Firstly, to introduce myself, I'm from Ajenta. We are primarily talking about video conferencing platform developed by a company Ajenta. I'm a front-end developer. And primarily what I'm going to be doing is we're talking a little bit about our journey with CSS modules. But first I want to take you a little bit more back in time. Story so far. Is myself, another front-end developer and a back-end developer. And we had transitioned licenses from a previous product called vScene to a new product called vScene. And this meant that we had to build something in quite a rapid pace. So it was myself, Ivan, and a back-end developer of ours. And the thing was that we wanted to do it as fast as possible. And we very much considered the logic. So the logic itself, it's very oversimplified diagram, I'll admit it. Obstructing the bottom, it says that's a pure component. So essentially, we have pure components within React containers. Oh, sorry. We have pure components within, yes, sorry, my apologies. We have pure components within React containers. It's very oversimplified. It's far more complicated than that. But the point about it is that we very much considered everything to do with logic. We considered what tools to use, whether to actually use React in the first place, whether to use Redux. We went back and forth on the back side of things, where with web services, AWS, all that kind of stuff. But we didn't look a lot at CSS. How would we utilize CSS? It was more like the data and the logic thing was more of a priority than how we'd style it. So in terms of pure components, you've seen something like this before. It could be a function or a class. But the essential thing is you can pass down props to it. It's predictable, it's simple, works great with type checking. That was actually something later on down the line we used, which was, we started using prop types, and then we transitioned to TypeScript. But yeah, anyway, pure components is predictable, simple, user, and we use it a lot. I've actually highlighted reusable at the bottom. That's how important it was. Because we use them everywhere. So to give you an example, I would build a big red button. As you can see, it says, I'm a button. It's a button. And we would do this ourselves. So we have a design side. They would provide a design brief. And then we would work on it ourselves. So as we're growing, we're trying to adhere to the design as it is. And the problem is, we can push to a Git repo, we can merge, but essentially we're in a little bit of a silo. So we have one person who has their own interpretation of forms or a button or a nav bar. These are very repetitive things that we use a lot. And I would spend a good 10 minutes working on my red button. Very proud of that red button. Sat down, the color's right, the border radius is perfect, the font weight is great. And then 2 weeks later, it would look like this. And I would think that someone's got some sort of anti-button agenda. But what actually was the case is that, because our CSS is global, you would have a lot of these kind of issues where, we'd push to a repo. In fact, have I decided about it? No, okay. We push to a repo, we'd be happy with ourselves. And I don't know if you've found this before, but once you're doing a project and you pass a certain milestone in that project, mentally you're kind of feeling as if I've passed that project. I don't need to think about it anymore. Don't need to go through the sort of, I don't need to be mindful of it anymore. And this is a bit of an annoyance because essentially these recurring issues keep on cropping up. And so what we'd have is, because the CSS itself is a global scope. And also the problem I was talking about before, where you'd have design inconsistencies, which was, I might have this amazing red button here, but someone else might have a slightly wider red button, or a slightly smaller red button, or a font weight button that'd be slightly different. And also the other problem was that the way we were working with it, it's slightly different TypeScript, where we push something and it doesn't compile, or There might be something that's quite in your face and immediate. But the problem with CSS, particularly if it's something that you're working on quite a big project itself, you would have this issue where you would push a button, but this button was in settings, or it'd be a different page or tab of the settings. So it's not something that really occurs a lot. So you wouldn't necessarily find it until your client might find it. And then you're going back and there's time spent fixing all these problems. And then you've already kind of gone past that milestone in your mind, so you have to go back and refresh, like, oh, how did I work with that, and what was the process for that? But yeah. So we went through a number of options. Essentially at this point, we kind of understood that this was a serious problem that we need to look at, address. So I'm going to run through a number of the alternatives that we looked at first, give you kind of the reasoning. I'm by no means an expert in these particular fields, but I'll give you what we kind of came together as a reason for not to use it. So BEM, which is a block element modifier. Essentially, it's a naming convention. So you could have the block name, element name, modifier name. One thing I forgot to mention is that we're very lazy. So this involves having this sit-down conversation to go, here's the style and process that we need to run through. And essentially at this point, it's rather more a, in fact, I've got an example of this. Yeah, so you would have the block name, the element name, and then modifier itself. Essentially, it is a naming convention. It's nothing that you have to import. It's nothing you have to install. There's no additional dependencies, but it means that we have to have this consensus. And as we're growing from this team of like 2 to 3 people to about what we are, that's about 8, I believe. So we'd all have to have this continual consensus, and then we'd all have to maintain it again. So the problem we had was that it didn't, it is hard to maintain. I mean, it doesn't seem off the bat if you all agree on it, and if you're used to it, but for us, it would be something that we'd have to think about again. And it didn't actually solve the problem. We'd have this issue where we were trying to abide by some makeshift name convention, but then here's these additional rules that come onto it. And again, something to be mindful of. Style components. I'll just say it straight at the back. This is actually quite a close one between this and CSS modifiers. So we'd have a style component, very grossly oversimplified. Essentially, you have some element of JSON within the project itself. So you would have, I've seen this, it's kind of compiled as it's similar to what you would have in an SCSS file or a CSS file itself. But I've seen examples before where it's actually more of a camel case approach where you don't actually convert it to a sort of CSS string, if that makes sense. And it actually does work quite well. But why didn't we go with it? Well, the main reason we didn't go through it was because I actually asked my developer colleague this, how many components and lines of code we have, and he just said, a lot. So we'd have to go through all of them retroactively to then modify each component we have. And then we would already sort of have this approach or this problem with component sizes. So they would be growing as well, and then it's something else to learn. The learning side's not that significant, it's not that big, but it's just something else. So yeah. And then CSS modules. I'll say straight off the bat, we use CSS modules more as CSS modules, but yeah. So if you look at it here, it's previously a button, but what you have here, along with a little bit of TypeScript, is we import styles. We kind of import it like it's an object of some kind, and then you reference within that object. So styles dot button, and that's that simple. You just have to import it. You can import it as styles, or you can import it as, I don't know, element or something, if you really want to make things complicated. It's that simple. It does require, obviously, some modification if you're using Webpack, because you have to implement that, what have you. Oh yeah, and the other thing is that once it compiles like this into the dev stage. So you say your block type, and then your element type, and then a little hash at the end. But when you put it in production, can you hear me? Is that right? Yeah. But when you put it in production, it's all a hash. So you're at that point, it's quite clean and it's quite nice at the end of it. So why do we go with it? Well, it's simple. Basically, there's no new tool to learn. If you can understand how to import anything within a React component, you can import something within, you can use CSS modules and that works fine. And it solved the problem. If you looked at BEM, it didn't quite solve the problem, but this reduces the scope itself and it's quite clean, it's nice. And it just works. And it just works. But you do you. Because if you want to abide by like a style guide, or if you want to, hello? It is cutting out, it's not just me, isn't it? Yeah, okay. I'll try my best. But you do you. Because if you want to have some style guide, and if you want a naming convention, then do that. That's absolutely fine. This is purely preference. It was actually quite close between CSS modules and style components because they compile in a similar way, and if you want a component with your styles in it for some reason, then you can do that, and style component seems to work for that. And also the thing is, because we have a lot of pure components and pure functions and then containers and what have you, we have this thing called Storybook. And essentially Storybook is this web application where you can import all your components in, and because those a lot of those components are just pure, clean, functional components, what have you, they're predictable, you can have a little catalog, and this is what we call it. We call it vscene catalog. So we have a button there, we have an input, I think this one is just an input. There we have an example at the top. And it's something that we can pick from. We actually have like 1 or 2 developers that's purely, their main role is to work on this. So essentially it's a key part of it. There we go. And one of the things is consistent, because if you have your own interpretation of your special little button, that doesn't happen as much anymore because it's essentially a catalog for it. Now I was going to talk about how to implement it in Webpack. I was going to talk about how to implement it in Babel, but if you have Create React App, it's simple. It's in there already. All you need to do is change the name for your CSS file, app.module.scss, and then just import it, and it works, and it's built in with Create React App. And I'll put a little note here first before we go into questions, is we're hiring. So if you're a junior front-end developer or anything like that, and you feel like you're so inspired by what I've said today, then we're looking for junior front-end developers. That's it. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions? I'll try my best to answer if you have any. Yes.
Oh, yeah, the Storybook thing that you showed temporarily there, is that something you're thinking maybe open sourcing? Or
Our beautiful little Storybook here is already available. It's not ours. So you can, I think if you search for it, I think it's like a Git repo for it. Not entirely sure, but this is freely available. It's not ours. I believe there was actually a previous talk a year ago at this React meetup about it, and that was where I was inspired to use it, and it seems to work really well. So yeah. Hello, yes.
I remember I wrote some app where the CSS related frameworks were used, so I think I was using Bootstrap and w3.css. And when we used to import the CSS over into a component, I remember I used to do it only in the root level component, and any child component used to inherit that, because once you do it at root level,
Yeah.
it generally goes to the entire project.
Yes.
So what is different here? Is it something that goes on individual component which is having a parent-child relationship in between? Or suppose if I want to use Bootstrap along with some other framework, something like that, in that way. So does that really help it here?
Okay, so sorry, I just realized I didn't ask I've got supposed to say questions before. Yes, okay. So you're talking about the difference between having the components, the individual components, to having a grandparent root component, then trickle down the styling between them? Is that what you're asking? Or are you asking the benefits for that situation?
If you import the styling for one of the child components,
Yeah.
then that goes and clashes with some CSS that is inherited from the root component.
Yeah.
Then it generally doesn't work together. That's what
You can do. I mean, so the question is if you can mix a CSS with a root component, and then possibly CSS modules with the rest of the application. Is that what you're asking? You can do that. I think we might have some kind of situation like that at the moment, but I think purely throughout it, CSS modules is great because depends how you implement it, but it can detect clashes. So if you work within a big application and then for some reason you've got a big red button and you decide to name another big red button, I think it tells you, is that right? It might tell you. It just hashes differently. So that works in terms of just reducing those collisions that you might have. And also, if you do it as a grand thing, well, in fact, we have a lot of variables. So we reuse variables for colors. So we'd have var, sapphire, and that's really useful just because we can reuse them as well. So it can mix between the two, but yeah, you do you, essentially. Yeah. Yes. How are we doing for time? There we go. We got. Okay. Well. Okay. We'll do these two more questions, and then I'll go with you first, yes. So, okay, yes. So asking about conditional rendering for different styles, and yes, you can absolutely do that. We do that a lot where we have themes. We actually tried to implement a theme, and because we didn't implement it fully, we decided to remove it entirely. But the whole idea of utilizing CSS modules for a theme works really well because. And also what you have with a lot of conditional rendering where you have a button that's danger or a button that's safe, whether it's like the background color is fine. You can just have that conditional in the class name itself. So if Boolean is true, then a return styles.danger, otherwise, you know. So it works very well, yeah. And then we have Leo's. Oh, is it the same question? Marvelous, okay, brilliant. I think that's me. Okay, great. Thank you very much.